Hey everyone, this is Chris, and you're listening to One Cross Radio. And just to be upfront, this is the fourth time I've had to record the intro because I've accidentally said several times this is the Radio Arcade podcast, which it isn't. I'm partially thinking of it as such because one, uh, myself and my boo Christian recorded an episode just the other day. Um, for it, but also, if you noticed a different theme today, it's because before Christian and I did and started Radio Arcade, Christian was a guest on a sub series on this show with him called Into the Weeds. And because the sub show was slightly different, I created a different theme, which I'm reincorporating here just because the subject matter of today's episode is a little bit heavier. We're dealing with death and real life stuff, so the happier go luckier theme doesn't really fit. Uh, and I biasedly, since I made them, I like them, but I've always enjoyed the Into the Weeds theme, so I thought I'd repurpose it for this. And on today's episode, like I said, we're getting out of our normal territory, and we're venturing back into some disaster waters. Um, and if you're looking at the title and the display picture, you might be like, Chris, what the heck? Why are we talking about shark attacks? Why are we talking about the infamous 1916 Jersey Shore shark attacks? Most of the time, you talk about Godzilla and comics and superheroes and light stuff that I can call nonsense. um, we know you're obsessed with Titanic for some reason, but what gives? Well, true believer, in the words of the late great Stan Lee, uh, there is a bit of a connection to pop culture here with this one. Um, it's something that through Shark Week, the event has become rather known. I believe it was a 2009 episode, did like a mini movie based on the Jersey Shore shark attacks called Blood in the Water. There have been books and then TV episodes about it called The 12 Days of Terror. But perhaps most famously, it inspired the first blockbuster and an episode on a movie I want to do an episode on the production of in a little bit. Of course, I'm referring to the 1975 classic Jaws, and and the book that inspired the film. Now, uh, the author of Jaws has said it wasn't directly inspired, um, but at other points he also said it was inspired, and so that's where I'm going to say it, Jaws was consciously or unconsciously influenced by the Jersey Shore shark attacks. Both the book and the film feature direct references to the Jersey Shore shark attacks. They also both take place, like the book and then the actual attacks take place during a tourist resort uh, summer town at the beginning of July. Both the film slash book and the actual event has the same amount of victims, though thankfully the real life events did have a survivor, and both feature uh, Dr. Victor Copleston's rogue theory. But we're going to get to that rogue theory in a bit. I would just be remiss if I didn't address the Jaws connection. Um, Heck, most of the time when you look up stuff on the Jersey Shore shark attacks, it will be like the events that inspired Jaws. It's a label that gets attached to this day. Um, all right, so now let's look at what happened, and I'm going to be straight up. This is an episode that deals with some unsettling things. We are talking about harm to people, death, unfortunately later harm to animals, um, and death with that as well. There is some, not like hyper vivid, but there are vivid descriptions of what happens. So if any of this makes you queasy, or if any of this is something that's gonna ruin your day or put you in a bad space, I'd recommend hopping off. If not, I hope you'll stay long. I did do a lot of research on this. Now, straight up, I'm not an expert. I'm a guy who Googles. But I'm a guy who Googles carefully, finds good resources, and I'm happy to include a number of those links in the description. Stuff from National Geographic. I think I've got an article from the Smithsonian. I'll try to find that afterwards, as well as stats from the International Shark Attack File and others. Those links will be in the description. Um, and of course, there's stuff that I find sharks fascinating. I've been terrified of them ever since I was a child and saw Jaws, but it is very much a fear out of respect. I'm not afraid that I'm gonna get attacked in a pool, or anything like that. So, what happened? To give the lay of the land a little bit and some of the attitudes. Um, Swimming did not become a regular popular pastime, um, in North America, in the US, until around the 1900s. Heck, it wasn't until the early 1900s that bathing suits were regularly available for people. Um, so sharks were always there. We just weren't in their territory and we weren't aware of them. And the science on them now is there's a lot more we know now in 2023, even a lot more in like 2020 in 2000, in comparison to 1916 when this happened. But at the time, there were prevailing attitudes that sharks were not a danger to man. Nothing was a danger to man. If you got bit by a shark, it could not be fatal, and it was because it was trying to attack something else. Uh, this would be rectified, tragically, due to the events of 1916. But thankfully, shark science has come a huge way, um, and hopefully more can come from it and lead to the preservation of these majestically terrifying but fascinating creatures. All right, so the shark attacks in particular, what happened there? Over 12 days in July of 1914, the Jersey Shore was the center of a succession of rare and at that time unthinkable 5 shark attacks, four four of which were fatal, and 3 of which happened on the same day in Matawan County, within a 3 hour time span. Um, the assumed shark responsible was caught and killed on July 14th, in Raritan Bay, which was a mere 2 to 4 miles away from the mouth of the creek. Um, all of this would have happened within a 75 or so mile radius. Um, and we'll get there. So the first attack happened on July 1st. The first victim was a gentleman named Charles Van Sant, who was 28 years old and from Philadelphia. Van Sant was on vacation at the Ingleside Hotel with his family in Beach Haven, New Jersey, a resort town. Before dinner, Van Sant decided to take a quick swim in the Atlantic with his dog, which was a Chesapeake Bay Retriever. Or, sorry, not his dog, but a dog that was playing on the beach. Shortly after entering the water, Van Sant was heard shouting. Bathers believed he was calling to the dog, but a shark was actually biting his legs. Van Sant was rescued by the lifeguard Alexander Ott and a bystander named Sheridan Taylor, who claimed that the shark followed them to shore as they pulled the bleeding Van Sant from the water. Van Sant's left thigh was stripped of its flesh, and unfortunately, he bled to death on the manager's desk of the manager's desk of the hotel at 6:45 p.m. Now, despite the attack, beaches along the Jersey Shore remained open. Um, and we're going to get more into why when we get to a further down section. But at this time, like I kind of addressed earlier, shark attacks, people did not think sharks could or would attack a grown person, let alone kill them. So there was a lot of, even though it was being reported as that, a lot of scientists and others were like, nope, this was something else. It wasn't a shark attack. Um, Cut to July 6th. Now, this is about I had it written down. Yep. So 45 miles up the coast from Beach Haven, we are now with Charles Broder or Bruder. Bruder was a 27-year-old bell captain at the Essex and Sussex Hotel in Spring Lake, New Jersey. And he was a 27-year-old gentleman from Switzerland. Um, Bruder was attacked while swimming 130 yards or 120 miles. Sorry, meters, not miles, meters from the shore. A shark bit him in the abdomen and also severed his legs. Bruder's blood turned the water red. After hearing screams, a woman notified two lifeguards that a canoe with a red hull had capsized and was floating just at the water's surface. Um, you can see how she thought that, but that also tells you just how much blood there was in the water. I mean, his legs got bitten off. Um, Lifeguards Chris Anderson and George White rowed to Bruder in a lifeboat and then realized he had been bitten by a shark. They pulled him from the water, and as they're pulling him out, they discovered the missing legs. And Bruder unfortunately bled to death in the boat while he was on the way to shore. According to the New York Times, women were panic stricken and fainted as Bruder's mutilated body was brought ashore. Guests and workers at the Essex and Sussex Hotel, as well as neighboring hotels, raised money for Bruder's mother in Switzerland, which is very sweet. It's very sweet. Um, there was then a pause of 6 days. We cut to July 12th, and I call this section in a way Terror in the Creek. Not to like sensationalize it, but if you put yourself in there, this would be terrifying. So I think it's appropriate. So a little bit of information on the creek and Matawan County. So the next three attacks took place in Creek and near Matawan County, and the county is named after the creek. And two of the victims lived in Matawan County. Matawan County was located 30 miles north of Spring Lake, and it was inland from Raritan Bay, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean. It's a of section of water in southern New York, um, and it's inland from the bay by 11 miles. The mouth of the creek was 2 to 4 miles away from the bay itself, but it was connected to the ocean. So there was the mouth, but they're pretty far inland. And Matawan felt to so many like people who visited, people who lived there, it didn't feel like a lake town or a resort or anything like where any of the other attacks took place. It felt like a Midwestern town. And part of that was like, this is a creek, this is a river. Like, we're it's connected to the ocean, but they're not thinking of it as such. Um, so with that location and it with its like with that location and the thinking of it being a river and stuff, this was an incredibly unlikely site for interactions between sharks and humans. Um, but unfortunately, there would be some that day. But there was the attitude at the time, like, it can't be happening. And even many who lived in Madawan weren't necessarily believing some of the headlines coming out of the newspapers about the other two attacks because one, sensationalism is running wild, and we'll get there. But then also the prevailing attitude at that time, again informed by many scientists at that time, was there's no way sharks could kill a human being. Um, but on that day, um, and with all that in mind, there was the local Thomas Cottrell, who was a resident of Madawan and a sea captain. He spotted an 8 foot long shark in the creek, and then he ran around telling people, and the town just kind of dismissed him. Like, what? No way. We're Charles, Thomas, are you drunk? Like, we're on a creek. What are you talking about? There's no shark in the creek. Get it together. Unfortunately, there was, and we're getting to our third victim, Lester Stillwell. This one is these next two in many ways are the hardest ones. Not that the others aren't tragic, but Lester was 11 years old, and like him just being a child so young and this happening, it's a different level of tragedy. But then the next one also has some even more tragic elements, which we'll get to. Um, so around 2 p.m., a group of local boys, including young Lester, were playing in the creek together at an area called the Wyckoff Dock. While they were there, while they were there and playing, at one point they saw what they described as an old black weather-beaten board or a weathered log. So they see this for a little bit, and it's kind of like, what is this? But it's also they're young kids, they're in a creek, they've seen weathered logs before, so that's why they're describing it as such. But as it got closer, the dorsal fin appeared, and the dorsal fin appeared, and then they realized, hey, this isn't a weathered log. This is a shark. Um, so the boys scattered, and they started getting away. Unfortunately, though, before Lester Stillwell could climb out of the creek, the shark did attack him, and he was eaten alive and pulled under the water. His friend saw that. Naked and covered in mud, the terrified boys ran from Wyckoff Dock down down Main Street, screaming that there was a shark in the water. But again, people were still skeptical. Like, no way. They did think something could have happened to Lester, though, because Lester was epileptic, and they were worried that he had had a seizure and drowned. Um, so they took the kids seriously about Lester being in danger. They didn't really believe it was a shark. There was like, oh no, no way. So as the kids were doing this, eventually they were joined by several men and businessmen and people from the town. Uh, they were joined by them, and they got them back to there so they could hopefully help Lester, including Watson Stanley Fisher. Now, Stanley Fisher, unfortunately, is the fourth victim, and his is a different kind of tragic, in my opinion. I'll get to that in a second. So Fisher and others dived into the creek um, to find Stillwell. Now, it seems they believed he was dead, but of course they didn't believe it was a shark attack. They believed he had a seizure and drowned. Um, they were in the water for a little bit, and after several dives, Fisher did locate Stillwell's body. Um, he found it. He brought it up from the bed of the creek, but while attempting to return to shore with the body, um, Fisher was attacked and bitten by the shark. Um, and he unfortunately lost Lester's body in the process. And that's where, to me, that's extra tragic. In a different way, Lester being 11 is very, very sad. A young life suddenly brought to an end. But Stanley Fisher, by all accounts, was an upstanding gentleman, and this person was just trying to retrieve the body um, for the parents. And then, as he's doing this, he's attacked by the shark, and there's no ill will at the shark. Sharks are doing what they do, um, but like, man, it's not like he had done anything wrong. Not that most people who are attacked by sharks do anything wrong, but I mean, outside of stuff like Shark Week, we're prone in fiction and in movies to like villainize them. And at points, it's like, hey, that character got ate and they deserved it. Um, in real life, that's not the case. And that's the case with Stanley. This man was just trying to uh, retrieve a body for a family, and he lost his life. But it did bring the reality of the situation uh, to everyone in Matawan, as this was in the sight of the townspeople there. So it now wasn't like, oh, Thomas, we think he's drunk rambling about a shark, or oh, it's a bunch of kids naked and covered in mud screaming because they're worried about their friend. You know, the active imagination. Like, no, this is in front of them. So this then became the reality and known. Um, so Fisher's right thigh was severely injured. He had been pulled from the water. Um, and attempted to be sent to the hospital, but he bled to death, unfortunately, at Monmouth Memorial Hospital in Long Branch at 5:30 p.m. Stillwell's body thankfully was recovered on July 14th. It was recovered 150 feet upstream from the dock. Then we come to our final victim, but also our thankful survivor, young Joseph Dunn. Dunn was a 14-year-old boy from New York City, and he was attacked half a mile up from the Wycliffe dock. And that attack was about 30 minutes after the fatal attacks on Stillwell and Fisher. So these all happened in very rapid, quick succession, which is, again, a rarity. Shark attacks in general are a rarity. Shark attacks perpetuated by the same shark are an even bigger rarity. And then three so close together, extremely, extremely rare. Um, so the shark bit young Dunn's left leg, but he was thankfully rescued by his brother and friend after a vicious tug of war battle with the shark. Uh, Joseph was then taken to St. Peter's University Hospital in New Brunswick, New Jersey. I actually feel like I got to specify that because if you're up here in Canada with me, when you read New Brunswick, you think of the province, and I initially thought that's a long trek. How are they going to get him there and alive? But thankfully, it was a town in New Jersey. Um, Young Dunn eventually did make a full recovery from the bite, and he was released from the hospital and got to rejoin his family. Later that year, after a couple months in hospital, on September 15th. So we're cutting to July 14th, which is the assumed end of the the attacks. So even though all the attacks had finished on the 12th, the reason I say the assumed end is as follows. On the 14th, Michael Schleisler, a taxidermist from Harlem, who was also a lion tamer from the Barnum and Bailey Circus, those are two very different occupations for one gentleman to hold. He was fishing in the Raritan Bay, again, which is a mere 2 miles from the mouth of Matawan Creek. While he was fishing, Schleicher caught a 7.5 foot, 325-pound juvenile great white in his net. Um, the shark naturally, understandably freaked out, and it almost sank his boat. Um, Apparently, Schleicher tried to cut the net to remove it, but the shark was tugging it. And while it was tugging and pulling him, the boat was almost getting pulled underwater. So Schleicher ended up killing the shark with a broken oar. Back on land, Schleicher opened up the shark's belly, in which was contained human remains. This part's going to be a little bit gross, but I'm just reading a direct quote. It was described as suspicious fleshy materials and bones that took up to two-thirds of a milk crate and weighed 15 pounds. As there were no further attacks along the Jersey Shore in the summer of 1916, scientists and ichthyologists at the time, and ichthyologists are shark scientists, they study marine biology, um, felt that this shark and declared that this juvenile great white had been the Jersey man eater. Now, this has been disputed, however, since. And many experts question if it was even one shark to begin with. In his book from 1976, The Book of Sharks, biologist and author Richard Ellis noted the first two attacks took place in the ocean, 70 and 25 miles, or 113 and 40 kilometers, respectively, from Matawan Creek. To assume that these distance attacks were perpetrated by the same shark that attacked three swimmers in Matawan Creek is stretching the rogue theory beyond reasonable limits. Many scientists also believe that the attacks in Matawan could have and probably were perpetrated by the bull shark. Bull sharks are fairly aggressive. They can swim and they can swim in both salt and fresh waters. Given that Matawan County is 11 miles inland from the Atlantic and bulls go into freshwater rivers and lakes, that's a fairly common occurrence in comparison to great whites who can only tolerate fresh water for very, very short periods of time. They need salt water. So this has led many to believe that the bull was the culprit, at least partially, for those three. It's still debated to this day. Now, of course, there is the findings of that great white, so it could have been, but there are other signs that point towards it possibly being a bull. And given the wide radius of all this, and there being many sharks in the ocean, there's no guarantee that it was just one. Give me a second. Luna is whining, so I'm going to let her outside. All right, so sorry, I'm back. Luna just wanted outside. So now I want to talk about something I've addressed a little bit briefly, and that's the rogue theory, um, which to me is unfortunately a bit of an infamous thing. Now, again, I'm not an expert, but I find sharks and shark attacks and just shark behavior fascinating and intriguing. Um, and also, I, like most people, probably became familiar with rogue theory because of Jaws. And yeah, so rogue theory was put forth by a surgeon, Sir Victor Coppelson, Dr. Victor Coppelson, during the 1930s to late 1950s. Um, in this, Copleston would suggest that once a shark had a taste of human blood, it would then only attack humans. Further, it would set up camp within certain waters and mark it as a territory. Um, and people latched onto that. People really latched onto that as an explanation for the Jersey Shore shark attacks. Um, but to most scientists, this theory does not hold water. While there are rare instances of the same shark biting or killing multiple people, like the Red Sea shark attacks in December of 2010, those are not only an extreme rarity, they are often informed, for lack of another term, by something else. In the case of the Red Sea shark attacks case, the oceanic white tip that was attacking people had previously been spotted being fed by divers. Um, the divers would hand feed the shark as it would swim by. I think they'd reach out with their right hand or their left hand, whichever hand it was, and there would be a pouch with food on the back of their hip, like above their buttock and upper thigh. And something that was seen as this white tip was was attacking people was the white tip was biting people's hands and then the hands and then the buttocks and upper thigh. Um, this shows like this was a learned behavior. This was the shark remembering easy access to food, seeing people swimming in a similar position and assuming like naturally that this was that situation. This wasn't a rogue animal just killing for the sake of killing. This wasn't a shark only targeting humans. It was a learned behavior. um, Rogue Theory makes for interesting drama. Again, looking at Jaws the book and the movie, it makes for an interesting motivator for a fictional monster. But many scientists have debunked it, and it's looked at as bogus by the community by and large, and it's been debunked time and time again. Unfortunately, it's one that's stuck with the public consciousness. And whenever there are a series of shark attacks, it's something that people who aren't experts are ready to bring up to this day. And Luna wants back in, so give me a sec. Okay, and we're back. So the next thing I want to touch on is some reactions um, at the time. So, what were the reactions of people, the media, um, the conspiracies, and the at time unfortunate war on sharks? So, at first, after the Beach Haven incident, scientists and the press were only reluctant, uh, only reluctantly blamed the death of Van Sant on the shark. The New York Times reported that Van Sant was badly bitten in the surf by a fish, presumably a shark. Still, State Fish Commissioner of Pennsylvania and former director of the Philadelphia Aquarium, James M. Meehan, asserted in the Philadelphia Public Ledger that the shark was preying on a dog and had bitten Van Zandt by mistake. He specifically de emphasized the threats sharks pose to human, saying, despite the death of Charles Van Zandt and the report of two sharks having been caught in that vicinity recently, I do not believe there is any reason why people should hesitate to go in swimming at the beaches for fear of man eaters. The information in regard to the sharks is indefinite, and I hardly believe that Van Sant was bitten by a man eater. Van Sant was in the surf playing with the dog, and it may be that a small shark had drifted in at high water and was marooned by the tide. Being unable to move quickly and without food, he had come in to bite the dog and snapped at the man in passing. This reluctance changed, however, with the event of the second attack, and the media's response was much more sensational. Mer- uh, many Many major American newspapers, such as the Boston Herald, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Post, and the San Francisco Chronicle, placed the story on the front page. The New York Times headline read, uh, Shark kills bather off of Jersey Beach. The growing panic cost New Jersey resort owners an estimated 250,000 or 6 million uh, 6,700,000 in adjusted to currency in 2022 in lost tourism, and sunbathing declined by 75% in some areas. Um, Shark sightings increased along the mid-Atlantic coast after the attacks. Um, and my joke here is sharks in the ocean. And of course, people are noticing more because now they're looking for them. And a panic was starting to take full swing. Local New Jersey governments made efforts to protect bathers and the economy from man eating sharks. The Fourth Avenue beach at Asbury Park was enclosed with a steel wire mesh fence and patrolled by armed motorboats. It remained the only beach open following the Everingham incident. After the attacks on Stillwell, Fisher, and Dunn, residents in Matawan lined Matawan Creek with nets and detonated dynamite in an attempt to catch and kill the shark. Matawan Mayor Eris B. Henderson ordered the Matawan Journal to print wanted posters offering $100 reward, or adjusted to inflation now, uh, $2,700 to anyone who killed a shark in the creek. Despite the town's efforts, no sharks were captured or killed in Matawan Creek. Um, Resort communities along the New Jersey shore petitioned the federal government to aid local efforts to protect beaches and hunt sharks. The House of Representatives appropriated 5,000, 130,000 in inflated current dollars for eradicating the New Jersey shark threat. And President Woodrow Wilson scheduled a meeting with his cabinet to discuss the fatal shark attacks. Treasury Secretary William Gibbs McAdoo, butchered his name, suggested that the Coast Guard be mobilized to patrol the Jersey Shore and protect sunbathers. Shark hunts ensued across the coasts of New York and New Jersey, as the Atlanta Constitution reported on July 14th. Armed shark hunters in motorboats patrolled the New York and New Jersey coasts today, while others lined the beaches in a concerted effort to exterminate the man-eaters. New Jersey Governor James Fairman Fielder and local municipalities offered bounties to individuals hunting sharks. Hundreds of sharks were unfortunately captured. The unfortunately is my comment on the East Coast as a result of the attacks. The East Coast shark hunt has been described as the largest scale animal hunt in history. And a headline from July 15th sums this whole section up as the Washington Post headline declared, U.S. declares war on sharks. Um, which it's I get it, but it's also tragic. It sucks that people died, but that doesn't mean we eradicate a species. Um, like, oh my gosh. And that's tragically an attitude that still happens to this day. Um, and sometimes people can have that attitude, and it's slightly more understandable. I believe I can't remember who it was, but there was a survivor from the USS Indianapolis, one of the deadliest shark attacks on record. Although not everybody died from shark attacks in that water, and this is again something an episode I want to do later. Um, that also ties into Jaws. Um, but one person, because of the horrific things he experienced, he's like, they shouldn't be alive. Given what he went through, I can under I don't agree with it, but I can understand how he got to that conclusion. This at the time is it's understandable, but it's also like, no, this shouldn't be happening. But this is a comment that it still happens to this day. In 2001, before the September 11 attacks, there was the sensationalist Summer of the Shark, and people were advocating online for the eradication of sharks. Never mind that we are going into their territory, and yes, we don't know a lot, but there are things out there that can tell us, and we're willfully ignorant of it. I love sharks, so that kind of attitude is upsetting, and the war on sharks and the huge hunt afterwards was also upsetting. This goes back to, yeah, those wrongs don't make this wrong right. Um, so, of course, though, during all this, there were numerous thoughts and conspiracies. As a shock to no one, some were skeptical of the experts at the time and offered alternative hypotheses. Um, and again, I'm not saying you just blindly believe everything. Um, that experts tell you, but it's worth looking into it and just not automatically questioning um, or outright ignoring everything because it doesn't fit your belief or your agenda. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. So back to this. So These hypotheses and other opinions were suggesting a non shark perpetrator or the influence of ongoing events associated with World War One. In a letter to the New York Times, Barrett P. Smith of Sound Beach, New York, um, 135 miles away the from the event on the far side of Long Island, wrote, having read with much interest the account of the fatality off Spring Lake, New Jersey, I should like to offer a suggestion somewhat at variance with the shark theory. Scientists believe it is most unlikely that a shark was responsible, and lots of people, though, believe it much more likely that that the attack was made by a sea turtle. Scientists have spent much time at sea and along shore and have several times seen turtles large enough to inflict just such wounds. Creatures are of a vicious disposition and, when annoyed, are extremely dangerous to approach. And it is a common theory that Bruder may have disturbed one while it was asleep on or close to the surface. So, yeah, at the time, a lot of scientists weren't believing it was sharks, so that was the general consensus. But even around the time of Bruder's attack, because there were more witnesses to it, um, and the legs being pulled off, and the people in the boats being witness to it, it was being taken more seriously. Scientists were now being like, "All right, this is probably a shark, but that doesn't make sense because sharks don't attack people." But you still had people looking for alternate theories like this. However, some of those alternate theories became conspiracy, and we'll cut to that. Another letter to the New York Times blamed the infestation on the maneuvers of German U boats near America's east coast. The anonymous writer claimed these sharks may have devoured human bodies in the waters of the German war zone and followed liners to this coast, or even followed the Deutschland herself, expecting the usual toll of drowning men, women, and children. The writer concluded this would account for their boldness and their craving for human flesh. So, as we can see, sensationalism was alive and well in in 1916, and unnecessary conspiracies got ridiculous then too, much like they do in 2022 and 2023. Some point I'd like us to learn from that lesson, but it doesn't seem like anytime soon. All right, so now I want to hit you with some shark facts, just because when we look at something like this, and as much as I appreciate something like Wikipedia, where it does have a file, not as it does have pages that don't go as in depth as, say, the International Shark Attack file, but it does have things that track reported shark attacks over the years, in America, in New Zealand, in Australia. Um, but when you read stuff like that page or about the Jersey Shore shark attacks, and then look at other shark attacks in quick succession, it's easy to kind of lean towards that opinion, that's been very much informed through things like Jaws and then other movies where it's like, no, these are monsters. And we start adopting the language of man eaters. Shark attacks on humans are incredibly rare. So, the most recent 5 year global average on shark attacks on humans is 72 annually. And as a result of that, around 5 people on average are killed by sharks per year. 5. That's one more per year on average than the event in Mattawan Creek. Given the huge amount of people, that's incredibly unlikely. It's a rarity. According to the International Shark File, in 2022, there was a worldwide total of 108 attacks uh, being documented. 57 of those were unprovoked bites, 32 were provoked bites, and seven were from a mix of boat bites, disasters, scavenges, and something at a they labeled as public aquaria. And then there were a total of those. The remaining eight are still being investigated as they have been ruled doubtful. They couldn't. No assignment could be made, and they weren't confirmed. So there's enough evidence to include it, but those might end up getting removed. Um, Shark attacks are rare. Like, even though we hear the numbers, like even I just said 108, that's not a lot. Like, you could think of it as a lot, but it's really not. I mean, that's not, that's like smaller than the population of middle schools, let alone high schools or towns or cities. Um, and that's across the globe. It's not a lot. And also, sharks don't have like sharks only have one way of figuring out what something is: biting it. They don't have hands. They can't just reach out and touch something. They can only bite it. And most bites are unprovoked and they're investigatory. They're sharks trying to figure out what the heck you are. And then, of course, you can look at the many things that we do um, unintentionally where we are emulating and acting like their go to prey of seals and other things. Um, so here's some other just facts about sharks. Overfishing has dropped the level of sharks across the world by 60 to 70%. What the hell? As per a study by the International Shark Attack File, you are more likely to die by drowning than be bitten by a shark. To further quantify those statistics, you are 3,820 times more likely to drown than die from a shark. The chances of drowning are 1 in 1,134 compared to the 1 in 4,332,817 odds of being bitten by a shark. In an article published by the New York Post, it revealed that more people have died in recent years from taking selfies than by shark attacks. Between the years of 2011 and 2017, 259 people died while taking a selfie, as opposed to just 50 shark related deaths in the same time span. There's a there's a great article I'm going to include that breaks it down even further. The shark attacks are exceedingly rare. When we go on that binge for information and we read about it, it can we're reading about a totality all at once, and it can paint the picture of this is it all the time, but it's not. It's exceedingly rare. Sharks have such an important place in our ecosystem. In the oceans, they do so much good. And yes, it's tragic and unfortunate and horrifying when people do get bit and attacked, but it's a rarity. It doesn't happen that often. Um, and it's not something that should be taken out on the species. The danger we pose to them, and it's believed that we kill up to 100 million sharks a year. Humans collectively kill up to 100 million of these creatures a year in comparison to what, 57 or 50 over a 6 year span. It's not the same ballpark. So I hope this was of interest to you. I find, like I've said numerous times, I find shark attacks and the history of it fascinating, but also because of how it has impacted media. Now, I love the story of Jaws, but the author Peter Benchley, after he wrote the book, after the movie came out, he learned about sharks, and he's like, I could never write this fictional story about it. Man-eating killer sharks make for great entertainment when done well. It can make for an enjoyable movie, uh, good story, and like a must-see blockbuster. But it's fiction. It does not represent the reality of sharks. Matawan and the 1916 attacks have gone on in infamy, but they're they're a one in a lifetime occurrence. Like that's not what sharks do. Anyways, I'll stop just not preaching, but you get what I'm going for. Yeah, people should stop killing sharks. We need to learn how to swim in their territory better because the ocean is their territory. It's not ours. It's just not. Man needs to take a step back on so many things. We got other things to worry about that we do to ourselves. Anyways, I know this is off the beaten path for us, but I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I did do a lot of work and a lot of research on it. We'll include several links below, so you can check out those articles yourself. Really hope you'll actually research this yourself. I'd also recommend that book. I can't remember the author, unfortunately, but 12 Days of Terror. Um, it's it's all just fascinating seeing what we thought we knew then in comparison to what we know now, and still makes you wonder what we think we know, um, and how much we've learned about sharks and everything since. All that being said, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, off the beaten path as it is, and we'll be back in a couple weeks with another episode. Hope you enjoy, take care, and God bless, my friends. Peace.